Welcome everyone to the Thursday night Creator Convo. I'm Noel Marshall and I'm here with my beloved.
Greetings, everyone. Bob Warner. Good to have you with us on a Thursday evening. Since there really is no such thing as time, it was all made up by man. Anybody that's watching this recording at any time that you think is on the calendar or the clock is now. And so we're delighted to have Kevin with us this evening from Final Exit to share some very helpful information that a lot of us value.
So Kevin, before I give you the magical talking stick, I'm going to tell everyone a little bit about the Co-Creators Convergence and all the wonderful guests we have coming up in the month of June. So everyone, please stand by. That is a little bit about the Co-Creators Convergence. So I know you want to know a little bit about Kevin as well. So Kevin Bradley is a professional writer, editor, and speaker, and a former hospital and hospice chaplain. He testified on behalf of medical aid in dying in the Minnesota legislature in 2016 and 2024. He co-founded Interfaith Clergy for End-of-Life Options as a chapter of Compassion and Choices, and developed a Right to Die online course for the American Humanist Association. In addition to being a Right to Die advocate, Kevin is a certified stress management counselor. And you can contact him at kevinbradley@proton.me. And also the website again, www.finalexitnetwork.org. So Kevin, welcome to the Co-Creators Convergence.
Thank you very much.
Looking forward to your conversation tonight. Welcome, Kevin, and I'm turning the magical talking stick over to you. So,
okay,
and just holler anytime you need something. I'm here.
Okay, well, this obviously is my standard slideshow opening screen. I thank you very much for inviting me here and for that introduction. I do want to point out a couple of things just to give you a little bit more context into my background and how that all converges. So as was mentioned, I was a hospital and hospice chaplain, and I am currently a counselor. I do grief counseling, I do stress management, focusing on PTSD as well as some addiction counseling. And there's a background there that my son is an addict, and he's glad to talk about it. But I discovered when I was in training for being a hospital chaplain, I did a 1.5 year internship at a VA hospital. And I had an opportunity to do the extended version. And because it was extended, I had the opportunity to decide what I wanted to focus on. So I chose mental health because I thought I was going to fix my son's PTSD and addiction. Of course, you cannot fix anybody. What I learned was how to model healthy boundaries. But that's kind of part of my background and why I got involved with the stress management, because if you study PTSD in depth, I kind of had no choice but to become somewhat of an expert in it. And then I also did work at Sanford Hospital, which is in Sioux Falls, and I worked in their pediatric unit. So it was very interesting for me to literally sit with dying veterans going back even to the Korean War. And then the next day I would be in a neonatal intensive care unit where somebody had just lost a newborn. And to watch that complete spectrum was quite heart-rending. After those incidents or those experiences, I was then hired for a hospital in Minneapolis, suburban Minneapolis, called Mercy Hospital, where I was again focusing on mental health. And the specific part of the mental health in the 2 hospitals where I did that work is that they were considered level 4 mental health, where they were locked units. And a big surprise to me was learning that they weren't locked for the rest of the world's safety. They were locked for the patient's well-being so that they felt safe. So a little bit background there. After that experience, I did do some home hospice chaplain work for an organization called Heartland Home Hospice. I am located in Minnesota, and they do their work in largely eastern Minnesota and western Wisconsin. As was mentioned, I have been very active in the Death with Dignity, Right to Die movement since 2016, mostly with Final Exit Network. So we're going to move into it. We're going to jump right into this. Is the question that I often will start out simply by saying, where do you want to die? Well, the standard answer for that is at home. The vast majority of people, statistically it's 80%, say they want to die at home. And most of us will say preferably in our sleep. One of my very first presentations for Final Exit Network happened to be for a Free Thinkers Association in northern Minnesota. And I asked this question, and there's a lady in the back who screamed that she wanted to die on a zip line with her hair on fire. I haven't been able to top that one, but statistically, we all want to die at home. However, that is simply not reality. The reality is that 20% statistically will die at home. Another 20% will die in an assisted living facility. And for some people, that might be home, but also it's the classic nursing home environment. So it can look an awful lot like a clinical setting. That leaves only 60%, or that leaves a whopping 60% of us who will most likely die in some kind of an acute care situation, such as the ICU of a hospital. The question is, why? Why do we not die at home like we want to? Well, the answer for that is simply because we're not prepared to prevent it. So we'll move it forward and find out. One of the reasons we're not prepared to prevent it is because we have 3 very well-funded and organized groups that don't want us to have that choice. Those groups are represented by this cartoon. The politician on the left, that's what he's supposed to be, as a politician. That's the government, so politicians and bureaucrats. And then the character in the lab coat, that's the medical establishment. And then on the right, of course, as you could probably guess, is the organized religion. Those are the 3 groups that do not want you to have this choice. We're going to start with the medical. So here's a little chart that surprised me when I learned it. Now, this data is a little bit old, but and it compares the amount of money spent in the days before death. And as you can see in the upper left, the black bars represent data from 1976, and the shaded bars are from 1988. And the point is that in that time span, so in over 10 years, the ratio hadn't changed much. So nothing really has changed, and I don't have a newer chart, but I will tell you that it's still pretty much the same across the board as far as the sudden increase. Now, if you'll notice, about a year before death, that is about where 3% of Medicare spending is starting. It gradually increases and then it jumps up. In the last 30 days of the average person's life, 40% of Medicare spending is done in the last 30 days there. Billions of dollars, billions with a B, would be denied to the entire healthcare industry if a significant number of people chose to minimize their own suffering by dying before they want to. So that is one of the biggest reasons why the healthcare industry fights against death with dying, is because you will take money directly from their bottom lines. So what are your current options? Well, your current options, you can refuse treatment. Whatever your diagnosis is, you can refuse to be treated. That's not a big surprise to most people. What a lot of people don't know, though, is that you have the legal right to discontinue treatment, even if it is life-sustaining, because there's a good chance, I saw this a lot when I was working at the hospital, somebody is brought in on a stretcher in an ambulance or whatever, and they're unconscious. So, of course, the medical staff will try to keep them alive. Then they go into ICU, and a day or two later, they'll wake up and they find out, oh, I'm in the hospital. At that point, if they don't want to continue treatment, they can demand that the treatment be stopped. And again, even if knowing that stopping that treatment will likely end in their death. Now, this can be a problem legally, because many hospitals will say you can't do that. And there have been many, many cases of fighting hospitals who do not want you to do that. The biggest reason that they fight that is because they have actually been sued for not sustaining life. And so they're kind of caught in the middle. But the fact of the matter is, if you are declared to be of sound mind, and there may have to be lawyers and psychologists involved to help make that determination, you can discontinue treatment after it's been begun. Another option that is gaining more and more knowledge is they call it voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, and it's known by the acronym VSED, and it's just exactly what it says. You essentially starve yourself. And this actually is done all the time currently. It's actually part of the natural dying process where the digestive system will slowly just stops. And so it's normal that you would stop eating and drinking if you're in the last stages of life. However, let's say you're diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and you're nowhere near the last couple of weeks of your life, but you don't want to go through that. You can force your digestive system to stop simply by no longer eating and drinking. That's called VSED. Now, one of the challenges with that is that it can take up to 10 days, and it is not comfortable. If you ever hear somebody saying that VSED is relatively painless, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Either they're lying or they're ignorant of the facts. If you have enough medication to make it comfortable for you, you're probably going to be unconscious. And so for the first 2 or 3 days without medication, it will be very, very uncomfortable. After about 2 or 3 days, there's a good chance that you have already stopped your digestive process, but then your family gets to sit and watch you wither away. And there's nothing pretty about that. We're going to move on here. So medical aid in dying is often incorrectly considered a synonym for death with dignity. Death with dignity, or the right to die, is actually a much larger umbrella, but it became known as part of medical aid in dying because the state of Oregon, which first legalized it, used the term death with dignity in their legislation called the Death with Dignity Act. So what exactly is medical aid in dying? Well, it is getting a prescription from a licensed provider that is made specifically to result in your death. Qualifications. These are just some of the basic qualifications. There are more, but the number one thing is that you must be diagnosed with a terminal illness, and I have terminal in quotation marks there because it is very clearly defined as meaning you will have 6 months or less to live if your disease is left to take its natural course. Now, that 6 months is up to your physician, and different physicians, of course, may have different the subjective ideas as to how long they think you're going to last. So it's just like the actuarial charts of insurance companies. They say, well, how much is a value of a life? Insurance company can tell you exactly how much your life is worth on the open market, unfortunately. And so statistically, based on your age, your overall health, and how far along your disease is, they have a pretty good estimate as to how long you will likely live. Now, the reason they chose 6 months is because that is when you are also qualified for hospice care. And that is a Medicare requirement. In order for you to have your hospice care paid for by Medicare, you have to be diagnosed with a terminal illness and be diagnosed again by a medical doctor as being within 6 months. So because of that 6 months, you also have to be recertified every 6 months, because it is not all that uncommon for somebody to actually get better when they go into hospice care. And I personally know somebody, as my wife's uncle, who graduated from hospice after the first 6 months and ended up dying well over a year later. And he told people that he felt better in those few months than he had for years. Of course, the disease did progress and he eventually did die, but not within the first 6 months. Okay, another qualification, you must be a mentally competent adult. So you may hear stories about people who are like Canada or Europe or whatever, where they're trying to euthanize patients, and people who are opposed to medical aid in dying will say, you're just trying to get rid of the useless people in our society. This isn't Nazi Germany. This has nothing to do with that. One of the very, very strict requirements of medical aid in dying legislation is that you must be mentally competent, and you have to convince the doctor, in fact, 2 of them, that you're not being coerced in any way. So that's 2 requirements. Another requirement is that you have to be able to use the prescription medication, which is usually a pill. I guess it could be a liquid form, but the point is that you have to be able to self-administer, is what they call it, which usually means swallowing. Now, my understanding is that there are some exceptions, like if you have something wrong with your throat or whatnot, there's a way around that. But usually you must be able to swallow. And one of the actually most stringent requirements that stops a lot of people because they don't know this, they'll be out advocating for medical aid in dying in their state, and they may even get it passed. Well, then they find out that you have to be a resident of that state in most states, and you can't go across borders. Now, this is actually changing to some extent. Oregon was the first, of course, and now they have relaxed that as a direct result of a lawsuit between a woman in Connecticut who sued the state of Vermont. I don't know what the exact legal terminology was, interstate commerce or something like that. But the point is that they settled with her and then they changed their requirement. And one of the underlying reasons why she won the case is that there are many situations where somebody may live on the outside of a city or just across the border. And I think of, for example, Cincinnati, Ohio. Well, Cincinnati is on the very, very southern edge of Ohio. And there are many people who technically live in Kentucky, just south of the Ohio River, but they work and they get their medical care in Ohio. Well, in situations like that, because medical aid in dying is considered a medical procedure, but it's the only medical procedure with a residency requirement. So that's how they won the lawsuit. They said you can't just have one medical procedure that requires residency. So this residency requirement is being relaxed, but it still varies from state to state. And last but not least, even if it becomes legal, in every single state where it is legal, you cannot force a doctor or the hospital to participate. So you may be all excited, you could devote a lot of time to getting medical aid and dying legislation passed, and then turn around and find out that your doctor is not going to participate. You have to find a new doctor. That is not uncommon. Where is it legal? Well, you can just see here, there are 10 states. I'm not going to call each one out, but there are 10 states plus Washington, D.C., where it's currently legal. There is active legislation going on in a bunch of other states. And in fact, it went through, it got farther in committees in Minnesota this year than it has before. But the legislation the legislative session this year just ended, and it didn't even get brought up in a vote in the Senate. So we're going to be going back to square one. And so as is happening in a lot of states, it's all about raising awareness long before it ever gets passed as legislation. Well, another option you have is you can go to Switzerland. They were pioneers in the medical aid and dying community. And over there, they have no problem calling it assisted suicide. The company that started it happened to be called Dignitas. And there's another organization there now called Pegasus, like the mythical horse Pegasus, but with an O. And I happen to know that the organization called Pegasus was started by people who used to work at Dignitas. So they're very, very closely related. And the reason that Pegasus was started was because they thought that the restrictions that Dignitas had were a little bit too tight. So Pegasus has a little looser restriction, and I believe specifically around mental illness. Now, you still cannot go to one of these places and just say, you know, I'm depressed, I want to end it all. That is not enough. But it used to be that Dignitas wouldn't even take you if you were under the care of a psychiatrist or anything. Pegasus thought that was a little bit too strict because you could very well be depressed because you have cancer, or you could be on medication, you know, for various reasons that may put you into a clinical depression, but you also have a life-ending illness. So those are the two main organizations in Switzerland, and there are others around the world, like the Netherlands. However, it ain't cheap. $8,000 to $12,000 American money, and that does not include travel or lodging. That is just for their services. So if you've got the money and you don't want to deal with the problems in America, you can always go to Switzerland. Well, you have a third option, actually, and that's Final Exit Network. Final Exit Network was started by Derek Humphrey. He was a Brit back in 1970-something, and he became famous initially because he helped his wife die in their home in the English countryside. She had been battling breast cancer. It went into remission and it came back, and she said, I'm done. So with the help of a pharmacist who he never named, he got medication that she took. He handed it to her and she ended her life. Well, he happened to be a journalist at the time. And because of his skills in journalism, he wrote a book. And the book is called Jean's Way, and that's his wife. And that was published in 1978. It became an instant bestseller, largely because of the notoriety or scandal, if you want to call it that. But it got him noticed. And because of that success, he was able to emigrate to America. And he went to work briefly for the Los Angeles Times. And then in 1980, in his garage in Santa Monica, he started the Hemlock Society, which you may have heard of. Of course, hemlock is famous because that is the herb that Socrates took to end his own life. Eventually, he ended up later on writing a book called Final Exit. And the subtitle there, I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but it says, The Practicalities of Self-Deliverance and Assisted Suicide for the Dying. I've had several conversations with Derek, and one of his little pet peeves is he wishes people wouldn't be afraid to use the word suicide. And we'll talk more about that a little bit. Over the course of time, the Hemlock Society grew, it merged with other organizations, and eventually the larger organization split in 2004. It split it into what is now Compassion and Choices. It wasn't that name then, but it is now, and Final Exit Network. Compassion and Choices' sole purpose is to pass medical aid in dying legislation. Final Exit Network's goal is to provide support directly to the people who are looking for a way to end their suffering. And it doesn't necessarily follow medical aid in dying. We get people who will, Final Exit Network will get people who they don't live in a state where it's legal, or they do live in a state where it's legal and they just found out that they don't qualify for various reasons. And so they come to Final Exit Network. And all Final Exit Network really does is we direct you to his book. The book lays out different methods that are available that you can end your suffering. And there's a 3-level requirement. It must be absolutely painless, it must be peaceful, and it must be certain. And Derek Humphrey and the people he worked with, they even tested this. Don't ask me how they tested it. We can get into that some other time. Anyway, that's the background behind Final Exit Network and how it's associated with Compassion and Choices. Both organizations trace their lineage back to Derek Humphrey and the Hemlock Society. So the mission of Final Exit Network is specifically to educate individuals in practical, peaceful ways to end their own lives. We also offer a compassionate bedside presence, and we will defend your right to choose. And by the compassionate bedside presence, it's just what it says. Somebody from Final Exit Network will be with you at the end if you choose. And if you don't have family, or even if you do have family and you want somebody from Final Exit Network with you. And defending your right to choose, that includes a Final Exit Network funded lawyer who will come and fight for you in a court of law. We have an exit guide program. That is the core. We also have the Speakers Bureau, which is why I'm here. The Final Exit Network also has an advanced directive. You may be familiar with advanced directives. It's like a living will, but specifically for healthcare. But we have one as an advanced directive specifically for dementia. Since we developed ours, others have done so also. In fact, Compassion and Choices came out with a little better version. So now if you go to Final Exit Network's website and go to the resources page, we will direct you to Compassion and Choices version, but you can also download the advanced directive for dementia that was developed by our own attorneys. We also have had a surrogate consultant. I understand that is in flux right now, but anybody in Final Exit Network is trained to help you understand what your options are as you go forward. Now, there definitely are some requirements. So I don't want anybody to think that Final Exit Network is just going to help anybody and everybody. And one of my favorite jokes is you can't come to Final Exit Network because you broke up with your first girlfriend and you want to end it all. No, it is provided to qualified individuals, and there are some fairly strict requirements. So the qualified, there is an application process. You have to get your medical records, would have to prove that you have truly been diagnosed with the disease. And the disease could be terminal, but it doesn't necessarily have to be terminal right now if you think about that definition of terminal being within 6 months. So for example, well, actually, I'll talk a little bit more about this. You do not have to be a member of Final Exit Network to use Final Exit Network services. Everything that we do is absolutely free. Now, there are some caveats. FEN, that's the acronym for Final Exit Network, obviously. It provides no equipment, and it does not provide any physical assistance. That is why we are always within the law. We've been threatened. We've actually been sued several times over the years, but nobody has ever been convicted of a crime or anything. It's just that they try to make it hard and they try to make it expensive because there are people out there who are trying to shut down the organization. And so they go after it financially. They just tie you up in court. And so one of the ways around or to make sure that it's not a legal thing is because assisted suicide is very specifically defined as providing physical assistance, and we don't do that. And last but not least, the client, we don't call them a patient, we call them a client, always has the ultimate say as to if and when they exit. We've actually had clients who feel a little bit guilty because they get in a conversation with somebody from Final Exit Network and they may think they take a lot of our time, and then they think they have to go through with it even if they change their mind. And we make it very, very clear that that is never the case. We never encourage anybody or discourage anybody. It is always entirely the client's choice. Now, I mentioned some of the requirements. This goes back to the medical aid in dying requirements. So notice the 6 months. And I did mention that one of the requirements is that you do have to be diagnosed with an illness. However, it doesn't have to be a terminal illness within 6 months. You do have to be a mentally competent adult, but that is the only requirement that is similar to MAID, because there is no prescription medication, and therefore there's no requirement that you can swallow. There is no residency requirement because what Final Exit Network provides is legal in all states plus Washington, D.C. And there is no provider involved. You are in the comfort of your own home, and because there's no prescription, there's no doctors involved whatsoever. So it really comes down to your basic requirements are that you must be diagnosed with a physical illness that will drastically affect your quality of life, and you must be a mentally competent adult. Those are the two main categories. But then it gets a little bit more detailed because all of your records will be reviewed by a medical review committee made up of doctors of various kinds, psychologists, psychiatrists, surgeons. I think we had an ophthalmologist at one time. And all of your records will be reviewed by at least 2 of those members at any one time. So if you go right now to the Final Exit Network website, this is what you'll see on our main page. And I'm just going to read that for you. We hold that mentally competent adults who suffer from terminal illness, intractable physical pain, chronic or progressive disabilities, or who face loss of autonomy and selfhood through dementia have a basic human right to choose to end their lives when they judge their quality of life to be unacceptable. So just like medical aid in dying, one of them can be a terminal illness. But again, you don't have to be within 6 months of life. You could also have an illness such as multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's, which aren't always terminal. You could live with those for a long time. So if you have something that results in what we call intractable physical pain, or that you have chronic or progressive disabilities, and then we kind of are pioneers in this area. If you face a loss of autonomy and selfhood through dementia, that could qualify you for exit guide program. And we can talk more about some details later. All right, now this is an important slide to me because I used to be very involved with medical aid in dying. In fact, I used to speak on behalf of medical aid in dying, and that's when I learned how restrictive it is. So let's say that you have your diagnosis, say a stage 2 cancer. And let's say you're like my father, and he died when I was in college. He had lung cancer. They didn't diagnose it in him until he was right at stage 4. So he had the treatment. It went into remission, like often happens, but then it came back. Well, he wasn't going to go through treatment again, but he isn't yet within 6 months. Okay, but now, so that's in my family history. Now, let's say that in a few years, I am diagnosed with, say, stage 2 cancer. The doctors might say, well, you probably will live for 3 or 4 or 5 years with this. But after seeing what my father went through, I want nothing to do with that. I don't qualify for medical aid in dying because I'm not within that last 6 months. But now what happens if I'm in stage 2 cancer and now suddenly I get muscular dystrophy? By the time my cancer has advanced to the point where I'm within 6 months, the muscular dystrophy will very likely render my body unable to swallow. or multiple sclerosis. So that is the challenge. So on the left side of this slides, those diseases are all known by the umbrella term of a degenerative neuromuscular disease. If you have any of those, they're not considered terminal, except maybe Lou Gehrig's disease, because that always ends up killing people because it affects your lungs. But you could live for a long time with all of those other diseases, even if you don't want to. The other side of this slide talks about a stroke. We've probably all known people who've had strokes. Well, you could have one stroke and it could paralyze half of you, but you could still lead a productive life, according to some people. Or even some cancers. They're not all terminal. I know people who have had cancer of the eye. They had their eye taken out and they ended up living a long time. So, but those are just some things that they can very much affect your quality of life, but they will not qualify you for medical aid in dying. One question that I get, because I used to be a hospice chaplain, is this: doesn't hospice provide death with dignity? And my answer to that is, that depends. What is dignity to you? The answer to that question is based on the fact that really the sole purpose of hospice is pain mitigation. So if you're okay being waited on, being bedridden, and I hate to be graphic, but this is just the way it is, you end up having people change your diapers as an adult, but you're alive, you're able to talk to people. If you're okay with that, then by all means, go into hospice. My mother was in home hospice. I sat bedside with many hospice patients. However, I also sat bedside with hospice patients who, when I would go visit them, they would pull me down because the hospitals and hospices, the patients will tell a chaplain things they won't tell anybody else. And when I was a hospice chaplain, I had more than one patient who would say, "Hey, chaplain, can you help hurry this along a little bit?" And I never knew whether they actually wanted me to give them medication or they just wanted me to pray harder so they would die faster. And I didn't dare ask that question. But the real question here is, yes, hospice can be an answer, but that depends on what it is that you want to do. Now, this slide is provided by the Oregon Health Authority. In order for them to pass their initial Death with Dignity Act, they had to agree to follow statistics of anybody who wanted to get the medication. After well over 20 years, these numbers have stayed pretty much the same. The top reason why people will choose to get medication that will end their life is simply because life is no longer enjoyable. Below that, they have lost autonomy. They no longer can get around. They've lost their mobility. Third below that is loss of dignity. And again, you have to say, well, what does dignity mean to you? But notice the top two are 88 and then 86. So they're very close. It's just those two things. Fourth on the list, they don't want to be a burden on family and friends. Then losing control of bodily functions. And finally, we get to inadequate pain control. 31% of people say that pain control is why they're in or why they're seeking this. So this gets back to my point about hospice. The single reason for hospice care is to help you control your pain. But that's actually not why most people want to take control over the end of their own life. And here's something that may be a bit of a surprise to some people. Because hospice is paid for by Medicare, and we all know Medicare is paid for by taxpayer dollars, the longer you are in hospice, the more money the hospice organization makes, and the more that fund has to be replenished by taxpayer money. So if that is a concern for you, just know that that's just the way it is. So just back to, as I mentioned earlier, the hospice organizations around the country and the hospital and pharmaceuticals, the one thing they agree on is to keep you alive as long as possible, because the longer you live, the more money they get. One question that comes up a lot, especially in discussions of moral or ethical, is the idea of what exactly is the word suicide? And that is because you'll have these organized saying, well, you can't do suicide. We have all these suicide prevention groups that are out there. Well, if you look at history, there has actually been something called rational suicide. Now, right now, if you go Google suicide, and you would specifically go to a typical suicide prevention organization, they will most likely define suicide as an impulsive, irrational act. That is the definition of suicide according to suicide prevention. And we've probably all heard this idea that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. My response to those two thoughts is, if you have gone through all of the requirements to qualify for medical aid in dying, or you've gone through all of the counseling, you've submitted all of your medical records, you've talked to your family, you cannot be accused of being impulsive. Whether you're irrational, that's why there's a qualification that you must show that you are of competent mental, of sound mind. As for a permanent solution to a temporary problem, yeah, that's true if you're breaking up with your first girlfriend or boyfriend. But if you've been diagnosed with stage 2 cancer and you have a history of dementia in your family and you don't want to die that way, that is not a permanent solution to a temporary problem, because both of those problems are very much permanent. It's just that you don't have any control over it. A little thing about rational suicide throughout history. It used to be considered noble or honorable, and it was noble even if you had intolerable pain. But again, who's to define what that is? Because we all have different pain tolerances. Or if you had an incurable disease, and again, that changes over time, because what was curable, what was not curable 50 years ago, may be curable today. But it also was perfectly acceptable for somebody to take their own life simply if they had experienced devastating misfortune or shame. We all heard stories of, like, the Japanese who didn't want to shame their families, and so they do the harikiri. But even more recently, every one of us has probably seen a movie or a TV show where some battle somewhere, somebody is mortally wounded and everybody else is going to leave, and they all agree that he's probably not going to live and they can't carry him anyway. And so they always make this dramatic scene out of making sure that he's got a handgun and one bullet. And that is with the understanding that if he's going to get captured, he is going to end his own life. And the entire entertainment industry and society considers that a noble thing. The fact of the matter is, he committed suicide, but he did it for a noble cause. So there we go to the sacrifice for a cause. So military people, obviously, they sacrifice for a cause. But also there are stories of self-immolation. If you're old enough to remember back in the Vietnam War days, I think it was Time or Newsweek magazine, one of its cover stories was about the Buddhist monk who lit himself on fire. Well, he killed himself, but nobody shamed him because he was doing it for a cause. And likewise, throughout history, all religions, many, many martyrs have killed themselves for their cause. And they are all being held in high esteem by society. I mentioned Socrates, so he chose hemlock rather than exile because exile was just too shameful. I mentioned harikiri, that's in Japan. And look how recent the last known harikiri was, 2001 in Japan. In India, there's a whole society that went from the 3rd century BCE to the 14th century CE, where entire populations of villages would kill themselves. And this was specifically the women and children, because if their husbands, who were the warriors, word would be sent that the battle has been lost, a messenger would be sent back to the village with that specific message, with the expectation that now the women and children are going to kill themselves in order to avoid being taken as slaves by the victors. And then many of us have heard of the story of Masada in Israel, where how many hundreds, maybe thousands of Israel threw themselves off a cliff rather than be captured by the Romans. Again, these are all considered noble or honorable deaths, but the fact is they killed themselves. Even today, as I mentioned, we have the story of avoiding capture, modern TV. But another thing is protecting your family. The average mother or father would willingly give their life to protect their children. Also, we have first responders. Anybody, a firefighter who dies or a policeman who dies in a line of duty, these are all held as very noble professions and a very noble and honorable death. But as brutal as this may sound, they chose those professions. So I could make perhaps an argument that says, you put yourself into a dangerous situation. Why should your death be considered any more noble than anybody else's? I chose not to be a firefighter because I didn't want to risk that for my family. That's not me personally, but that I could use that as an example. But the fact of the matter is, society actually approves of what it considers a noble suicide. So the question comes down to is, are we going to let society make that decision? Or do you think you should be allowed to make the decision as to what is noble? So we have our politician, and we had the medical, and now we're going to look at the state with that politician. And so we have to ask, why was suicide ever illegal? Well, this is where it goes back to. This is Sir William Blackstone, very highfalutin sounding name, wrote this thing in the Commentaries on the Laws of England back in the 18th century. And he wrote that to take one's life is an offense against the king, who has an interest in the preservation of all of his subjects. A few years ago, my wife and I were watching reruns of Boston Legal because I never saw it the first time. But I remember one particular episode where, the more bombastic lawyer was arguing against state-assisted suicide. And he specifically said, the state has an interest. It is in the state's interest to prevent suicides. And I remember stopping to think, what exactly is the state's interest in my life? As far as I know, the state doesn't take any interest in my life unless I don't pay my taxes. They don't care one way or another. Well, this gets back to this slide that I'm showing you here, because way back in the day, to be a subject meant you did not own your own life. The king or queen literally owned your life. So the reason that suicide was ever illegal was because if you ended your own life, you weren't guilty of murder, you were guilty of stealing from the king. That is where it started. So down over the course of time, that is where the stigma started, is the state's interest in keeping you alive. A typical king wants to keep all of his subjects alive. Why? Because they're the ones who farm, they're the ones who go to armies, they're the ones who keep the king living in the lap of luxury. Same thing can be said about today. The single biggest reason why the politicians and the bureaucrats want you to stay alive is because your taxes keep them in power. So the next one, we had the medical community. We've already discussed that a little bit. So the religious community, of course, this is my favorite because I am an ordained minister. So one of the classic arguments that people make is they say, well, doesn't it violate the sixth commandment? Well, if you're like me, you learned the sixth commandment as thou shalt not kill. The fact is, it doesn't say that. It never said that, except maybe in the King James Bible, but that was a horrible mistranslation, because the actual translation in the original Hebrew, it said murder. Now, you may have heard this, but what you may not have heard is that it's really important to understand the difference between killing and murdering. Because again, in the original Hebrew, the word murder was very specifically defined as the deliberate taking of another's life with malice. Well, if you're going to ending your own life, that's not another's life. So automatically, you're not guilty of violating the sixth commandment by ending your own life by the definition of the word of the original language. So there you go, another's life. Now, again, some people will say, well, what does the Bible say about suicide? Well, the fact of the matter is, if you look at the typical Bible of the typical American, it usually consists of what we call the Old and New Testament. And there are 6 references to somebody ending their own life. The last one on the bottom, that's the story of Judas. If you knew the history, you may know that Judas hanged himself from a tree after betraying Jesus. That's the only story in the New Testament. The others are all stories from the Old Testament. Now, the kicker here is that you can go to any Bible and you can read these passages, and I challenge you to show me where the scriptures actually say it was wrong. And you won't be able to, because all of these incidents were simply reported as a fact. Neither the act of ending their life or the person doing it were condemned for doing it, simply reported as something that happened. Now, the third thing that I got when I was a hospital chaplain, I would have people say, well, what you're doing is thwarting the will of God. I love that word, thwarting. It sounds like something out of Shakespearean England. My response to that is, if you're in the hospital, how did you get here? If you called 911, then you thwarted the will of God. If you came here in an ambulance, you thwarted the will of God. If you're taking any prescriptions or aspirin or vitamins, you're thwarting the will of God. Unless you are living completely off the grid, wearing clothes that you made from plants that you grew or animals that you harvested, you are thwarting the will of God every day. And one of my favorite parts of doing this today is you and I are thwarting the will of God right now by the fact that we're using the internet and computers. I did not experience this myself, but when I was at the VA learning to be a chaplain, my supervisor told me a story that he was in the ICU. And he had 2 families, and they were waiting, 2 patients, I'm sorry, in the ICU, and they were both on the edge of death. And both families were on their way to, come and intervene or just be with their loved one. And the ironic thing, or I don't know if ironic is the right word, but the point of the story here is that one family said, you must do everything to keep my loved one alive because it's the will of God. The other family said, don't you dare touch so-and-so. You are interfering with the will of God. And both of them were holding the same Bible and quoting the same scripture. So I think it's interesting that the voice of God sounds an awful lot like our own, depending on what we want. So the bottom line here is, what do these 3 groups have in common? They maintain their positions of power and their institutions of power, whether it's the medical establishment, institutions of government, or institutionalized religion. They only maintain their positions of power by keeping you alive so that you can keep paying them, whether it's through taxes or whether it's through insurance or whether it's through selling your home in order to live another 6 months. That is their common denominator, is that only dead people don't pay taxes and dead people can't pay for their care. So what we try to do, and this was mentioned earlier in the introduction, was we just want you to be prepared. That's the best way to avoid things. So what does that mean? Number one, make sure you have an advance directive or living will. It's the same thing. It just depends on where you live. Also, and this is a surprise to some people, in addition to having an advance directive, you should also have a healthcare power of attorney. Now, why is this important? Well, the reason it's important is because I have personal experience where somebody had an advance directive and it was not honored by the doctor. The doctor looked at it and the signature was too old, according to that hospital's policy. Well, how would I know what the hospital's policy is? So the way to make sure your advance directive is followed is by giving somebody power of attorney, and they are the ones who argue with the doctor. And my classic story is make sure that is a very strong person who is willing to stand in a doctor's face, wave your advance directive in their face, and say something to the effect of, "This is my mother's advance directive. You will honor it, or I will own this hospital in 6 months." Are we on that same page now? You'll get their attention that way. Also, make sure it is current. I learned this the hard way. As I mentioned, I saw a doctor say, "We can't accept this because it's too old." Well, how do you know what's too old? So what I suggest to people is that every year when you do your taxes, also review your advance directive. See if you still want the same thing. Sign it again and have it dated and witnessed. Do it every year at least. In addition to that annual time, or maybe not tax time, maybe around your birthday or maybe an anniversary, but every year at least. In addition to that, anytime there's a change in your family, like a new baby, or somebody dies, or there's a divorce, or some kind of a change, when those things happen, go in and update these things. Make sure that your family knows where your power of attorney documents are. You might be, I was amazed to find out that, oh yeah, I learned to never put my family direct or my advance care directive in a safe because nobody can get to it. And it can, if I don't have a good safe, it'll be destroyed in a fire. So I read someplace that it should be in the freezer. And I'm going, okay, that sort of makes sense because that's the last thing that's going to go in a fire. But my question is, does your family know that that's where your directive is? But more important than where they know it, do they have their own copy? Many people will say, "I wish I had a copy of my mom's family advance directive." So make sure that all of your children have a copy so that they know what you want and they can be your power of attorney if you want them to be. Also, make sure if you're having a situation that you do not want to be resuscitated or intubated. Half the world did not know what intubate meant until COVID. Well, now we know what that is all about. So just make sure that you have your DNR or DNI, which is intubate, very clearly labeled. Now, I used to think that the best place to put this was on your refrigerator because that used to be the gathering place. I no longer think that. I think you should have at least 2, maybe 3. Put one on your refrigerator because that's where people gather. Tape one to your headboard because if somebody calls 911 because you're unconscious, the rescue squad is going to go into the bedroom and there they're going to see the DNR. They may go right by your kitchen to get to you in the bedroom and they may never see your DNR. So put one on your headboard or on the door to your bedroom. Make sure they can see it. So one of the things that our surrogate consultant has been doing, and again, we're in a transition out of doing that service directly. We'll be consulting with various people. But one of the things that we want to make sure you understand, and you can always call Final Exit Network to find out exactly what are your legal rights as a patient. I mentioned earlier that you can withdraw treatment at any time. Find out what the authority really is of a legal representative. What can a power of attorney? What does that really mean? These last 2 things here are really important. You have a right to adequate pain relief by your definition. And you also have the right to decline medical treatment by your definition. Now, if this goes afoul of hospital policy or by the facilities policy, that's when we might be able to help you to just understand and learn. In fact, a little story about this. My brother died here just 3 years ago. I almost got thrown out of the hospital. They threatened to have security haul me out because they were not doing what I knew my brother wanted. I was amazed. I was a little bit embarrassed. He has seen me give these presentations, but he did not have a healthcare directive. So there I am. I go to the hospital, find out my brother is dying, and he didn't have POA assigned to anybody. He didn't have a healthcare directive. He didn't have a will. He had none of that prepared. It was a nightmare. So I was angry. I was grieving, and I was screaming at the medical staff. And suddenly, the medical staff people, some of the medical staff said, "Well, maybe we should get our ethics committee." And suddenly I realized, oh my God, I knew that. I used to be on a medical ethics committee. How could I possibly forget that every hospital has an ethics committee that you can appeal to if you disagree with the doctor? The ethics committee ended up ruling in our favor, but not until after just horrendous screaming. Like I say, they threatened to have me taken out by force. And so I think if I, as a trained chaplain, forgot that there was an ethics committee, the average person is not going to have a clue that even there is such a thing as an ethics committee. But most hospitals by law have to have either an ethics committee and or somebody who is called a patient advocate. They're there to fight for you, possibly to argue with the doctors. So just know that. At the end result, if you cannot get what you want done, contact us. Now, this is where you do need to be a FEN member, where an attorney will come and argue for you. I said free to FEN members. That's out to the consulting services. But we also want you to know that the legal part is not to be mistaken for medical advice. So we don't really have any doctors who will give you medical advice, because we're of the opinion that you probably, or you should have your own medical doctor that you're getting your medical advice from. We are here to help you if you're not getting specifically your advance directive honored. Wrapping this stuff up here. Another thing I learned that is very, very important. Again, this is because of my brother's death. Make sure you have beneficiaries on all of your accounts. In most states, your beneficiary is automatically your spouse, but you have to be careful. It's always best just to make sure that they are specifically named, and not only on all your accounts and assets, but make sure any real estate, any vehicles, all of your retirement accounts, make sure that you very specifically name who the beneficiary should be. And something I learned a few years earlier is the difference between a co-owner and a co-signer on a checking account. I was a co-signer on my mother's checking account for probably 30 years. Then she died. I found out that the bank shut her account down. And I said, well, wait a minute, we still have bills to pay. They said, you can't get in it because you're not a co-owner. And I said, yes, but I've been a co-signer. And that's when I learned the difference. You need to be a co-owner of the account in order to prevent the bank from automatically shutting your account down. Go talk to your bank, find out what their requirements are to allow you to continue. And there's another thing that's available in Minnesota. I don't know if it's available in other states. It's called transfer on death. I can look at my car title, and the car title says TOD, and then it names my wife. And that specifically means transfer on death, so that my car automatically becomes her car if I die. It never has to go through probate. And I believe, depending on where you live, you can have that done on almost anything. So your house, all this kind of stuff. It's transfer on death. Again, it depends on where you live. That may or may not be an option. We talked about the advance directive for dementia. That is a companion to a standard advance directive. And again, FEN does offer free legal assistance to FEN membership. FEN members to help ensure compliance with this. Now, there is one caveat I need to say here. We have not had our advance directive threatened in court. So we are actually actively looking for, I mean, we don't want to ever want this to happen, but we want to put the word out there that if you have a advance directive for dementia and you find that it is not honored, we want you to contact us, because not only will we come fight for you, but it will help us to refine it to make sure that nobody else has to go through quite the same problems that you did. Because like I said, to date, we don't know how many people have used it, and we don't know if anybody have tried to use it unsuccessfully. We just don't have the data yet, and we're hoping to find that out. Write your own obituary. You may have heard about this. One of the things I like to do is to read the obituaries. And it's not just find out who died, it's because I can tell you right away who wrote their own, because they are hilarious. Every obituary is hilarious. You can tell who wrote them. Also, when you write your own obituary, ask your family and friends to help you. It can really prompt some very meaningful conversations. Now, here's a big surprise that a lot of people are surprised by, and this is some of the best advice I got when I was learning to be a chaplain, and the best advice I ever gave to anybody. Plan your own funeral. Casket versus cremation versus green burial. Do you know what your options are? Do you have a cemetery plot? Is it paid off? What poems, what songs, what scripture, whatever do you want? Have every single detail written down. And now here's a key little gotcha. Assign the person that you want to do everything, but make sure you have a backup. Why? Because by the time you die, the person that you assigned may have already died. So make sure that you have at least 2 people assigned to each of these roles. And this, again, is an opportunity to write letters, to record a video, and these can be profound opportunities to have those difficult conversations. The single most important way that you can be prepared is to make sure your family knows what you want. And these can be very challenging. And so one of the questions that I often get as a spiritual counselor talking about these things is, how do I start the conversation? Well, you can do this. You can gather everybody around the Thanksgiving and table, say, I want to talk about my funeral. That's probably not going to go over very well. However, there's a way to do this. You could say, I have something important to discuss, but I'm afraid you'll get upset. Now, how did you feel? What was the shift in your own energy when you read that? There was no distancing. Automatically, when anybody you love says something like this, you automatically say, oh, I promise I won't get upset. Please tell me what's on your heart. Then they say, well, I want to talk about my funeral. And chances are you will get upset. But the key is you have invited the conversation. And that's the key to how to have these conversations, is to find a way to be invited into it. So this is just one example of, to say I have something important. There are a lot of different ways you can start this. Maybe you know that somebody's going to come visit you for a while. And so rather than hide your advance directive, put it on your kitchen table. Sit down and have some coffee. They look over and say, Mom, what is this? Oh, that's my advance directive. Would you like me to help me work it out? There are a lot of ways to invite the conversation, but the key is to have them ask you what's going on, because then they're part of the conversation. Little thing about Final Exit Network is volunteers. They do have two permanent paid people, the head of the Exit Guide program and our executive director, but it's predominantly volunteers. In our speakers bureau especially, we give presentations in person or like this and virtually. In person, it's preferred that you have at least 20 people just to sort of make it worth our while, frankly. But again, they're free. Now, Final Exit Network welcomes donations, but I want to make it very clear that there's never an actual cost. In fact, the membership is so cheap that it could not survive if it only relied on its membership fees. The vast majority of our funding comes through donations aside from memberships. In fact, we get some of our largest donations from people who aren't members. Maybe their mother was a member and they died, with or without Final Exit Network information. Or we may get a bequest from somebody's as part of their death. We were named as a beneficiary. So most of our funding comes through donations of some kind. But the advantage of being a FEN member is, again, you have access to the legal advice. But another thing I learned about why membership is important, because people have said, well, if it's so cheap, then what does it matter for a member? Well, the difference is, let's say that I'm out there talking about Final Exit Network, and I have a member of the press call me up and say, hey, I hear you're advocating for this organization. Tell me about it. Do you have membership? I say, yes. And they say, well, how many paid members do you have? I've had this conversation with several journalists. And if I would say, oh, we have about 20, they don't care. But if you say, well, we actually have 3,000 members right now, suddenly they're interested and they go, oh, can I write an article about you? So what I tell people is, even if you don't think you will personally benefit from Final Exit Network, if you think what we do is valuable, become a member, maybe only for 1 or 2 years, because then we get to say to the press, we have 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 members, and then we get the word out. Because the single biggest problem that we run into, and when I started getting involved in this group back in 2016, at that time, the Speakers Bureau had a specific goal, we thought we did, that we needed to persuade people that what we do is legal, it's above board, and all these different things. We quickly discovered that the vast majority of people who are in these presentations think we're doing a wonderful job. The problem is nobody knows we exist. And they all say, I wish I had known about you 2 years ago or 5 years ago. So the best way you can help us is to become a member, but also to tell other people that you know about us, and specifically invite a FEN speaker to give a presentation at an organization like this, whether it's in person or virtual. That could very well be the single best thing you could do to help us. Again, the Speakers Bureau, you can become a member, give us a donation. I don't like talking about the money, but kind of have to let you know that you can do a charitable distribution from your 401k. Remember us in your estate planning. Those are all the normal things. Okay, I did my duty. I talked about that. You can also sign up for a magazine. You can go right to our website. I'm going to go forward. There's our website. You can go up to the subscribe on top. You can subscribe to the newsletter. You can go over to services, and that's a drop-down menu. That arrow is pointing to, and then the other arrow pointing to the right is to the Speakers Bureau. That will open up a page where you can request a speaker, and it'll step you right along the process. We do have various resources out there. That one happens to be highlighting the blog, where we talk about all kinds of things. Anything related to death with dignity is there. Lots of information out there. And that's really it. You can contact anybody through the website, or you can send an email to info@finalexitnetwork.org. Somebody earlier, it was your lovely host, talked about contacting me. I do want to point out that my email address has a T in it, and it's kevintbradley@proton.me. So you're welcome to reach out to me. But again, you can contact me, or you can go directly to Final Exit Network. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so I can see your lovely faces. And I'm open to questions.
You turn on yours first.
Okay, I'm going to add people as they turn on their video. I know some people can't because of where they are, but thank you, Kevin. That was even better than what when you were at our church, you can only speak for about 20 minutes. So we only got a smidge, but this was like an avalanche of such valuable information, so comprehensive, so well presented. Wow. We did have a question. Carol, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Oh, yeah, sure. So it seems like a simple thing to do would be to like have a wristband. That way, wherever you are, your permission or I guess people's smart whatever devices could do that, but it just seems to me that like if there was an indicator for a DNR.
Sure. Wristbands, people have necklaces, there are a lot of different we used to call it a medical ID bracelet back in the day. There are a lot of different ways, and I would say use whatever works for you, whatever you're comfortable with. The fact is that some people can't wear certain things, or maybe God forbid, they've been in an accident and they're in a full body cast, so, there may be various reasons, but yes, I totally agree with you. whatever it takes to make sure that anybody who shows up will see what you want, because many people do not realize that if you call 911, the rescue crew is legally required to try to resuscitate you
Yes.
unless they are given clear directions not to.
Right.
Mm.
So I'd like to ask one more thing.
Go ahead, go ahead.
This is my brother-in-law suffered a stroke at an early age in his 40s, and it was nearly fatal. And they life flighted him to a Minneapolis hospital. And the doctor literally said to my sister, in the middle of all this trauma, we had to drive following, to get there. And he literally said to her, we need to ask you if you want him intubated, because we can't undo it if you if you change your mind. And essentially, I mean, she doesn't even remember them asking her that question. I was standing there and I was, first of all, shocked, but secondly, it flipped the mentality for her, because he was non-functional, completely non-functional at that time, and they did not know what was going to happen. And yet, our urge is to prolong life and to support life. And so, but she does not even remember that he said, if you say yes, we can't undo it.
Well, and I think you hit on a really key point, because anybody who's in this situation is overwhelmed with emotion.
Yeah.
You cannot think straight. We have all been in a situation where we do things and then years later we think back and we say, what was I thinking? Well, the
Mhm.
fact of the matter is, when you're in a traumatic situation, your blood-brain chemistry changes. Specific to PTSD, for example, if you are exposed to a traumatic event, 132 chemicals change in your body. Your skin becomes more sensitive to changes. We've all heard, the hair goes back on the back of your neck and your arms, and it's how we have survived as a species. And it stays that way for up to 36 hours.
Hmm.
Because we are genetically, in our DNA, programmed. It's like, okay, that saber-toothed tiger almost got me. Is there another one around the corner? And so post-traumatic stress is actually good. It is what happens right after a threatening thing that keeps you alert, waiting for the next shoe to drop. The PTSD, as I mentioned, that 132 chemicals, if we're not allowed to relax after that 36 hours, then that normally ordered chemicals become disordered, hence post-traumatic stress disorder. The chemicals are not given a chance to go back to the original. Now, it used to be that anybody who in the military used to be that anytime you were sent off on a life-threatening mission, if you took direct enemy fire, you automatically got 30 days of leave. Well, over the years, that went away. Now, you're lucky if you get to stop for lunch and they send you back out. One of the reasons why so many of our veterans have PTSD now is because they were exposed continually and their brains didn't get a chance to reset those chemicals. Now, it actually can be treated, and I've successfully treated a bunch of veterans. But anyway, my point here is that what happens in any kind of a traumatic situation, and being told that God forbid, your child, because I've seen that, is maybe need to be intubated, that is a traumatic event emotionally. And so the same kinds of things happen, is that the part of your brain that is responsible for logical thought is not getting the blood it needs in order for you to think clearly, because that blood is going to your emotional part to keep you alive. So I tell people, please don't be embarrassed because you made a decision 5 years ago that you're wondering what you were thinking, because you weren't. You were not capable of thinking at that time.
Kevin, can I get clarification? Carol said she was told they couldn't undo it, but from what you're telling us, if he had a power of attorney and they said, I don't want him intubated,
They were. This is where it gets into the legalities of it. You would, yes, they can undo it, but you would have to sign 27 release forms, you know, and then they're still witnessing, and they may have a situation, they say, well, we'll take the tube out, but we're gonna send them home, and you're gonna take the tube out at home, because we're not gonna risk of being sued here for taking the tube out. And the problem, unfortunately, it's up to the individual hospital policy, and therefore up to the individual state. So you just have to know what the policies are. But who knows? I mean, the average person has no reason to research this stuff. None of us find out these things until we are living it.
Go ahead, Carol.
Well, I was just going to say too that my husband and I both have a healthcare power of attorney, living will, et cetera, all those things. But it seems that we've been told that if any blood relative questions the decision, they can essentially stall or put a timeout on any further decision making. Do you know about that?
They can try. But again, that's actually one of the reasons why I don't necessarily recommend that your power of attorney be a family member, because family gets too emotionally invested.
Interesting.
There are actually law firms that specialize in having a power of attorney for you, that will fight for you, even if that includes fighting against your family, because you were hired them to do what you wanted.
Yeah.
So again, it comes down to the laws of individual states, and sometimes it comes to policy. And another thing I didn't get into in the presentation as much as I often do is, if the facility is connected with a church, you have a whole nother layer to deal with. So if you, I tell people, if you're thinking about going into like a nursing home or an assisted care facility, you better find out if they support VSED. If it's a Catholic organization, they will not. In addition to that, they are money-making operations. And sometimes you go into a facility like that and it's owned by one company. 3 years later, you find out that it's been bought out by another company and they have different policies, and you had no clue.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm sorry. Two of the major hospitals in Columbus, Ohio are owned by religious organizations. And so, you know, like Riverside Methodist Hospital, and and so people, I'm not sure how much people understand that they need to know the bottom line for the whole organization, because that can make a big difference.
Yeah. Well, then if you think about it, I would randomly say right now in any major city, you pick 10 churches, and I would bet a mortgage payment that 8 of them are going to have a religious background. Just look at their names: Mercy Hospital, St. Joseph's Hospital, St. Mark's Hospital.
St. Jude.
Half of them started out as a religious organization.
Right. Right.
Interesting point.
Kevin, do I remember from your presentation before that if we become a member, that you keep on record what our POA is or something?
Oh, you have a registry.
Yes,
Registry.
yes.
Tell us about the registry.
One benefit of membership and Find Legs and Network is that you become a member of an online living will organization. So that it's you get a card to carry in your wallet. And I can tell you this actually works. I saw it happen, because if God forbid you are taken into an emergency room or something, one doctor is taking care of you, another person is going through your wallet. The reason they're going through your wallet is to see if you're a donor, to find out if you have a blood type, to see if you have any restrictions. So having a card in your wallet saying that you're a member of the living will, they automatically know, oh, they can go online and they can see what your current will is. And then everything stops if your will online conflicts with what they're doing. So that's one of the benefits. And actually, I think the name of the organization changed since I got involved, but that is still a benefit of FEN membership, is that you get to be involved. You get to have this online will. And one particular advantage of that is we no longer live in a society where you may have the same doctor all your life, or you're traveling. You know, once upon a time, people rarely left their zip code. Well, nowadays, I've lived all over the country, or people are traveling, a very mobile society. So there's a very good chance that you may have your first life-threatening situation in a city where nobody knows you.
Yeah.
And so you can go into that hospital and they go into the living will registry, and it's online, it's everywhere.
There, a couple, I'll combine a couple of them, Kevin. Someone had put, Noel might have put, how do they determine mental competence? My question was, how can you be mentally competent, because that was such a key point for you, and have dementia?
Right.
Well, you can't once you are in that stage.
Do it before.
That's why the phrase that Derek Humphrey coined was that there's a window of opportunity.
Hmm.
If you wait too long, you're no longer mentally competent. And that's actually the legal argument for why some people would say, well, if you have dementia, or actually this also affects people who've had a stroke, because a stroke can drastically affect your personality.
Oh, yes.
And so what you wanted in your advance directive before you had dementia or Alzheimer's or before your stroke may be very different than what you want now. So the question comes down to is, are you really the same person? And books have been written about this, entire legal arguments
Right. Yeah.
about whether or not you can legally honor somebody's advance directive after their mind has been affected by some way, because they're still a person, but they don't want that anymore, or they're saying they don't want that anymore. So it gets to be a very dicey, situation as to what is mental competence. But to get back to your original question as to how they determine that, there are some pretty standardized tests that you can go into, and they can tell how far along you are in a dementia cycle. And a classic one that a lot of people may have seen on TV shows or whatnot is somebody will say, okay, Mr. Bradley, I'm going to give you a list of 5 random words, and they'll say like
Right.
elephant, banana, Pluto, whatever. And then they have a conversation, and then they come back and say, okay, what were those 5 words?
Mm-hmm.
First time I saw that, I'm thinking, hell, I don't remember what those 5 words were, I and so a lot of these tests can be very subjective.
Yeah.
But usually those tests, that one kind of a test is the first that if there's a question, then they bring other tests out, and then they get more nuanced. And of course, nowadays, with CT scans and
Well
whatnot, and I mean, back in the day, you were either senile or you weren't. Now there are at least 8 different classifications of dementia.
Yeah.
Depending,
Right.
the different, now we know of this thing called Lewy body dementia.
Right.
Thank you, Robin Williams. Whoever heard of that until that happened? And there's Alzheimer's, but there are actually several different kinds of dementia, and they can give you a blood test now to determine which kind you have. Well, that wasn't
Wow.
available 50 years ago.
Wow.
I wasn't aware of that.
My family has some dementia that seems to be familial. And I don't know that, and I'm just curious, like, is there a genetic marker kind of thing that people are aware of that, is there a way that people can kind of, I know that they
Well-
check for plaque in the brain.
Right. Well, I think it depends on the kind of dementia.
Okay.
For example, I believe that if you specifically have what they call early onset dementia or early onset Alzheimer's, that tends to be more hereditary than later onset dementia.
Okay.
The later onset dementia we used to just call old age senility.
Right. Yes,
Mhm.
yeah.
So it depends on the type. So there are different kinds of tests that they can give, and they'll tell you whether or not it can be genetic. But sometimes it's known to be genetic, but it's also known to skip a generation,
Yes.
Mhm.
or it comes from a particular line, of the family. So
So is
there are a
there
lot. Go
a
ahead.
secondary aspect to that then is there's that question about, do you know, pre-existing condition, that kind of thing. So is there an insurance reason why you would not want to have that test or record made?
When you say an insurance reason, you
Good
mean
question.
in
Yeah,
order to
Very
make
good
sure you're not
question,
denied
yeah.
insurance? Is that what you're
Right.
getting at?
Yeah.
is that what you mean?
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that can get tricky. In fact, one of the things that I often get asked, and I didn't include it in the presentation, is whether or not somebody who does choose to end their own suffering, are they then denied life insurance?
Mhm.
And the answer is no. The caveat or the requirement by law, but this also can vary depending on where you live, and it can depend by your insurance company. But the
Mhm.
overarching rule is, if you have a life insurance policy for at least 2 years,
Mhm.
then the fact that you end your own life does not impact your beneficiaries.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and the whole point
That's what
there is,
ours is.
yeah,
Mhm.
they want to make sure that you didn't take out life insurance and then 6 months later,
Ah,
Just because then you had it planned right away. Yep.
exactly. So
Okay.
2 years is the general mark, but you
Mhm.
need to check with your insurance
That's your
company,
policy.
and you need to check your policy. And that would usually mean you're checking out which state, because for example, my insurance agent, even though I'm in Minnesota for a long time, we kept our insurance agent in South Dakota. And so if I would go to my insurance agent in South Dakota and say, what's the policy? I have to remind him, by the way, I live in Minnesota.
Right,
Mhm.
So they have to be aware that it's not just where your insurance agent is, it's where you live plus where they do their business.
Mhm.
Thank you so
yeah,
much.
Yeah.
thank you.
I have one final question, then we really will close. But this has been, thank you for going over time. Hope that was all right. I didn't ask.
That's
So,
fine.
um, so what if the person decided they wanted to be, I guess, even if you just said on your license plate, you're an organ donor, but then you decide to go this other route, then there's no organ donation after if you
Right.
do this route.
If there, especially if there are family members there,
Mhm.
if you if you're in there and obviously you're not going to live, they will ask the family. They will say, well, we see that, you're, in fact, my case is you see that, your mother or your father or your brother or whatever, they have a donor on their card. Do you wish to honor that? And they're very careful about how they word it, because they want it. And so they use the word, do you wish to honor that?
Mhm.
It's like you're somehow dishonoring their memory if you don't abide by that. But I believe it's required by law that they ask family. They can't just swoop in and start taking organs without the family's consent, regardless of what is in their advance directive and on their driver's license or whatever.
Oh, really?
Really?
The
Okay, that's
the driver's
interesting.
license will not overrule surviving the family. In fact, personal experience, my wife's father, he lost his wife here a few years ago, and she actually was a donor. But when it came time, he couldn't do it. And so he said, no, not doing it. He couldn't bring himself to do it. And for him, it was a religious thing about expecting her to have the bodily resurrection and all that stuff. So,
Would that also apply to, as the lawyers say, issues, children? Saying no, I'm not going to let you take their organs, even though it says so on their driver's license.
they could cause a problem. That is why, it's really important to have the power of attorney, because that overrules a blood relative. And it's also, you get into I mean, nowadays with blended families,
Mhm.
you know, step families coming in there. So
Sure.
it's always good. I just say it's the best default is to have a non-family member have power of attorney. Because I can guarantee you that when the time comes, you're gonna disagree with, even though you may have sat down with mom and say, oh, absolutely, we're not gonna watch you suffer. Well, I saw a lot of people change their minds because they can't let go.
Right,
At
exactly.
at that last minute, they just can't let go.
Mm,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
okay. Well, we really do have to wrap here, but this has been so helpful. And I don't know what the numbers will be, Kevin, but
Okay,
I will try my best to find it out, but I know I'm going to spread it far and wide. And
Yeah.
okay.
Carol, you're welcome to share it. And I'm just going to, plead that anybody, if I shared it to my family, you'd have your 20.
Correct.
That's easy when you're one of 15.
Right.
But thank you so much. This has just been so valuable. And
Well, thank you for the
I'm not sure what the
invitation.
membership is, what it costs, but I know it's worth its weight in gold. So
Okay.
Absolutely.
thank you so much.